the world, both low and high, rich and poor together. My mouth shall speak wisdom. The meditation of my heart shall be understanding. I will incline my ear to a proverb. I will solve my riddle to the music of the lyre. Why should I fear in times of trouble, when the iniquity of those who cheat me surrounds me, those who trust in their wealth and boast of the abundance of their riches? Truly no man can ransom another or give to God the price of his life. For the ransom of their life is costly and can never suffice, that he should live on forever and never see the pit. For he sees that even the wise die. The fool and the stupid alike must perish and leave their wealth to others. Their graves are their homes forever, their dwelling places to all generations, though they called lands by their own names. Man in this pomp will not remain. He is like the beasts that perish. This is the path of those who have foolish confidence. Yet after them people approve their boasts. Like sheep they are appointed for Sheol. Death shall be their shepherd, and the upright shall rule over them in the morning. Their form shall be consumed in Sheol, with no place to dwell. But God will ransom my soul from the power of Sheol, for he will receive me. Be not afraid when a man becomes rich, when the glory of his house increases. For when he dies, he will carry nothing away. His glory will not go down after him. For though while he lives, he counts himself blessed, and though you get praise when you do well for yourself, his soul will go to the generation of his fathers, who will never again see light. Man in his pomp, yet without understanding, is like the beasts that perish. Verse 1, we read, "Hear all peoples, give ear, all inhabitants of the world." This is a universal appeal to all mankind, man, women, and children throughout all the land. And it is a call for wisdom. And this psalm, Psalm 49, is actually quite unique in the Psalter because it's really not written like a psalm. It's written, as the writer says in the first 4 verses, a parable, a proverb. It's a call of wisdom to all mankind. Now, what's unique about the wisdom here is that it has God, Yahweh, involved, and we will come to see this great verse in verse 15, actually quite a unique verse in verse 15 as we go through the psalm. But in many ways, this psalm is a wisdom psalm, very much like what we see in the Proverbs. And what we see with wisdom literature is actually kind of common among the religions of the ancient Near East, where it's calling all mankind to sort of open up its eyes and to look around and to see the sort of cause and effect realities of the world around them, and to make wise decisions, to live according to the precepts of the world that surrounds them. And it's sort of unique, if I could be so crude. It's not really inspired wisdom, but wisdom that is all mankind is privy to. And that's why you have sort of this universal appeal, where all mankind is able to use their minds and sort of open their eyes and make right conclusions by using their discerning faculties as they see the world around them. Notice verse 4, "I will incline my ear to a proverb. I will solve my riddle to the music of the lyre." Notice first here the idea of music. It needs to be reiterated. All of the Psalter and all of the Psalms have sort of this poetic, rhythmic tone to them. All of the Psalms were meant to be played to music. They were written for music. And there's this idea here with the psalmist where he's figuring out the riddles of the world as he sings a song, as he plays this riddle to music. And I think there's something to be said there, that the Psalter, if we remember that the Psalter is one that is written for music, is written to be sung. There's times where I am kind of in a rut. I don't know about you, but you're stuck. You don't really know what to pray to the Lord. You just kind of, those times where when you pray, it just kind of feels like you're throwing words up to the wall and it's just not going anywhere. You're just kind of in a rut. I'll come over here sometimes, only when my secretary's not here, and I'll pick up a hymnal and I'll pick out a hymn that I know very well, and I'll just start to sing. And it's amazing when you start to sing how just things start to be illuminated for you. Song is a means by which God has given us to sort of illuminate the reality of his wonders and his truth to us. And here we get, I will solve my riddle to the music of the lyre. Now, you might be like me. You don't like the sound of your voice. Make sure your secretary's not around when you sing, as I do. But there is something about song. There is something about the Psalter that is written to music, where in singing there's an illumination to the truths of God that we might not get as we sit there and try to talk to ourselves, try to talk ourselves out of our ruts. And sometimes what we need to do is just sing a hymn and sing the Psalms. And it's hard to explain, but there's just something that happens when you sing the truths of God's word. If you have a bad voice, make sure you're by yourself, but go ahead and sing. And notice he says, I will solve my riddle. And it's interesting, wisdom literature in the Hebraic scriptures, especially in the Proverbs, it creates this idea that life is a riddle. If you like riddles, I know my wife likes riddles. If you like riddles, then you should like life, because life is a riddle. And wisdom literature in the Proverbs is essentially telling us, who are made in the image of God, who have minds, who are not like the dumb beast. Notice in verse 3, I will use understanding. We'll see a contrast to that later in the psalm, where you're a dumb beast when you live for riches and you live without understanding, almost like you live like an animal. And wisdom literature is essentially calling out to the human being, the man made in God's image, to live as one with understanding. To put away your iPhone, to put away the technology for a time, and to open up your eyes, use your mind, look at the cause and effect realities of certain paths, see where they lead, and make wise decisions. And again, this is not inspired knowledge. It's to all people. Aristotle, Plato. Unbelievers are great examples of this. But it's the idea of, you have a mind, use it. Look at the world around you, use it. Make wise decisions and live as a human being and not a dumb animal. And sing it to yourself from time to time if you want. Now, all commentators really break down this psalm into 5 sections. You don't usually see that. All commentators pretty much agree that this psalm is broken down into 5 sections. First, the intro, verses 1 through 4. Second, what we will call foolish riches, verses 5 through 9. Third, the great equalizer of death, verses 10 through 12. Fourth, trust in riches versus trust in God, verses 13 through 15. And then fifth, a final appeal, verses 16 through 20. Having gone through verses 1 through 4, we'll go ahead and skip the intro and go right into verses 5 through 9, the foolish riches. So first, foolish riches, verses 5 through 9. Verse 5 through 6, notice, conveys the rich as oppressors. And you see this common theme that those who oppress the poor and the weak are those who are rich, and they use their riches to gain power and influence over the poor. And there is a call for those who are under their thumb not to fret, because verse 7, truly no man can ransom another or give to God the price of his life. I don't know if you know of the philosopher Voltaire, but if you know anything about the philosopher Voltaire, he was no friend to Christianity. He used very acerbic language against the Christian faith, and actually quite offensive terminology when he came to all religion, but especially Christianity. And he was extremely rich, Voltaire. And at the end of his life, it is said that he said to his doctor as he was dying, I will give you half of all I possess if you will give me 6 more months to live. And of course, the doctor could not give him 6 more months to live. Here's Voltaire, hated Christianity and the things of Christianity, lived for himself, was all about the Enlightenment, all about man, and at the end of his life, he thought his riches could give him more days, and it could not. And I think that's a great example of what the psalmist is saying here. Notice also in verse 7 who it is that needs to be paid. No man can ransom another or give to God the price of his life. The one who owns life is God, but no one can ransom the life of another. Notice also that we might expect the text to say something akin to, the rich man can't ransom his own life. Maybe we could expect the psalmist to say something like the rich man thinking he could give his money, like Voltaire, and ransom his own life. But that's not what verse 7 says. No man can be a substitute for another man. No mortal man can give his life for another mortal man and ransom his life. Your mind should be ringing about the substitutionary atonement, but that's going to come in verse 15. So no mere mortal man can give over his life to the point that it saves another. Second, the great equalizer of death, verse 10 through 12. Read verse 10 with me. For he sees that even the wise die, the fool and the stupid alike must perish and leave their wealth to others. In the end, both the oppressed and the oppressor, the rich and the poor, end up in the same place in the ground. And it's actually quite stark language. The one who is rich, who maybe is the intellect, who is maybe one who uses his intellect to get ahead in life, he is just like the stupid. It's this stark contrast. It's not just the fool and the wise, it's the stupid, and it's the one that's on top, and they all end up in the same place. Death is the great equalizer. And then we see in verse 11, their graves are their homes forever, though they called lands by their own names. Now in the ancient Near East, it was common for people to consider naming something as a form of ownership of something, right? We think of God telling Adam to name the animals right after God says that Adam is to have dominion over all the creatures. The manifestation of Adam having dominion over the creatures is him naming the creatures. And for the ancient Near East, to name something was to have a permanent ownership over it. Sort of this idea, I name it, it's mine, and it's mine forever. Yet here it seems the psalmist is saying, the only thing that we truly have our name on and our ownership on is the grave, is the ground when we come to death. So all we truly have our name on is the grave. So we see the great equalizer of death, the poor and the rich, the stupid, the intellect, and everything in between end up in the grave. If you think that's depressing, go ahead and read Ecclesiastes. This has nothing on Ecclesiastes. You get a bit of Ecclesiastes here in Psalm 49. Third, trust in riches versus trust in God. Verse 13 adds an important element to the rich. Notice it includes even those who follow them. Now, this is interesting because I think we often think, well, I'm never going to be rich, so this psalm's not really for me. But here's what is verse 13 saying? It's saying even those that follow the rich are those that are under the condemnation of Psalm 49. And I think that's really pertinent to our day and age. We think of the celebrity culture that we live in today. I turned on the television not too long ago, and TMZ came on. You guys know what TMZ is? You guys ever heard of this? And I didn't watch it too long. Don't worry, your pastor doesn't watch TMZ. But I was just interested. And TMZ is basically these reporters that go out and follow these celebrities and give sort of reports on what they're doing as they're leaving clubs and as they're doing these common everyday things. And I'm sitting here thinking, does anybody actually like this? And clearly they do. TMZ's been on for years. I'm not saying anything against Taylor Swift. Don't hear me saying anything against Taylor Swift. I know nothing about her music. I know nothing about Taylor Swift, but the Taylor Swift phenomenon and the acolytes of Taylor Swift is a little frightening. They'll follow Taylor Swift as though she's sort of this kind of god. Now, they're never going to be talented as Taylor Swift, and they're not going to be as rich as Taylor Swift, but it's the idea that if I follow her, if I follow her methods, there's this fantasy of being like her. And I think that's what Psalm 49 is talking about, this idea of following those that are rich and following and hanging on every word that they say is you being condemned under Psalm 49, not just if you have the wealth itself, but if you follow such people. If you fantasize, what is it that your thoughts go to? 10th commandment. I think the 10th commandment encapsulates all the previous 9. It's sort of the capstone to it all, coveting. Do you covet your neighbor's wife? Do you covet their riches? What is it that you think about when there's nothing to think about? Does your mind go to mansions? Does it go to that rich person over there, the good-looking person who has all the influence and power? And you are under the condemnation of Psalm 49. So it's the idea of following this method, not just having the riches, but following this method. Again, I know nothing about Taylor Swift. I want to reiterate that. Verse 14, death is their shepherd. Very stark, horrific language here. This is quite a horrifying picture. Those who live for riches, who put their confidence in riches, are being led and shepherded by death. There's an old Scottish pastor, Alexander MacLaren, who gave a sermon, and he made the point that perhaps the psalmist here is thinking of Psalm 23 and making a contrast, where the Lord is my shepherd, and he leads me beside still waters. He leads me into eternal places. But here in Psalm 49, those who live for riches have death as their shepherd, and leading them not into still waters, but into the grave itself. It's quite a startling picture. It goes on, verse 14, their form shall be consumed in Sheol. We've come across this word Sheol before in the Psalter. It's repeated throughout the Psalter. Sheol is really the place of death for the Hebrew people. It's the place of the underworld. It's the place of the grave. And note the language that it shall be consumed in Sheol. In the ancient Near East, it was common to see the ground as that which swallows up the dead. As the dead decays and is consumed by the ground, this idea that the ground swallows up the dead person. Rich people often look pretty impressive, don't they? Today, let's face it, especially in America, they're usually quite good looking. They look pretty good. But look at them after a few days in the grave. And the psalmist is saying, that's who they truly are. What you see of them a few days after in the ground. I don't know if you guys have ever read, maybe you had to read it for school, I don't know, The Picture of Dorian Gray. It's a great book, and Dorian Gray is this good-looking man, but there's this picture of him in the attic. And the picture is a picture of who he is in the inside. He's good-looking, he's wonderful, he's a murderer, he's terrible, he's a wicked man. And the picture in the attic is decaying and ugly and becoming more and more horrifying as a picture of what's inside of him. Yet he on the outside looks beautiful, looks wonderful. Yet the picture is actually a picture of who he actually is in the inward man. And who the rich man is who lives for riches, who he truly is what he looks like now in the ground, if you were to dig him up. That's who he truly is. And I think that's what the psalmist is saying. Verse 15, Derek Kidner. Spoke about Derek Kidner with Jenny this evening. Derek Kidner says of verse 15, he writes, the great but God of verse 15 is one of the mountaintops of Old Testament hope. The great but God of verse 15 is one of the mountaintops of Old Testament hope. Let's go ahead and read verse 15. It is a great passage. But God will ransom my soul from the power of Sheol, for he will receive me. Now, the Hebrew that reads, for he will receive me, is actually, he will take me to himself, and is the exact Hebrew construction that you get concerning Enoch in Genesis 5, verse 24, which reads, Enoch walked with God, then he was no more, because God took him away. And if we are to imagine any Hebrew that has any semblance of the Hebrew scriptures, most likely when he's reading verse 15 of Psalm 49, would immediately think of Genesis 5:24. And the idea of Enoch who's taken to God and is with him in eternity. Note the personal touch to this. He will receive me, or he will take me to himself. It conveys this idea that life is found in the personal God, in God himself. And for Sheol to be conquered, God must take the person to himself. Remember verse 7, that God is the owner of life. Why is God the owner of life? Because life is in God. And in order for us to have life beyond the grave, we must be taken to life, which is God. Life is in God. And again, remember verse 7, God is the one that needs to be paid because he is the owner of life. But no mortal can pay the ransom price to God that will redeem life. How can God pay the ransom price to himself? Kind of sounds like an odd scenario. How can God pay the ransom price to himself that redeems his people? Well, the gospel is the answer. He must become man in the person of the Son in order to pay the ransom price to God the Father. And in this way, God brings his people to himself. So a connection with verse 7 and verse 15, we see the incarnation. We see glimpses of the gospel hidden underneath. And remember 1 Timothy 3:16, the mystery of godliness. What is the mystery of godliness? It is Jesus Christ. And here we see that mystery clouded in verse 7 and verse 15, but it comes out to light and is revealed when the God-man comes, Jesus Christ. But I like what one commentator says, that this passage presents us with two options. We leave this world either with God or with nothing. I think we all know the saying, it's all or nothing. And what Scripture is presenting time and time again is you leave this world either with God or you have nothing. There's no second option. It's either you have God or you have nothing. Fourth and finally, the final appeal, verse 16 through 20. We get this final appeal to put to heart what the psalmist has been saying. And verse 20, we read, man in his pomp, yet without understanding, is like the beasts that perish. In other words, to have your chief aim in life to be riches and material wealth is to live like a dumb animal with no understanding. To not recognize that you have been made for eternity, but rather set your heart on what moth and rust destroy, is to live like a dumb animal. And just to go full circle as we close here this evening, remember wisdom literature, again, the Proverbs and wisdom literature is calling for mankind to open up their eyes and to contemplate reality. And I think the Proverbs and wisdom literature is so pertinent to our day and age because we have so many distractions. I think of AI. You're going to write a letter, you're going to write something, and you say, I don't want to stop and think about what I have to write. I'm just going to type it in AI. And the practical benefit is going to be there. You're going to have a beautiful letter or whatever it might be. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying anything against AI. But there is something to say where we need to be Proverbs-type people in a day and age that is pulling us away from stopping and contemplating and looking and seeing and discerning the things that are before us. And what wisdom literature is always calling us to do is use your mind. We live in a day and age where really our minds are really relegated to laziness because we have computers, we have everything else that can do our thinking for us. And Proverbs and wisdom literature is telling us and reminding us amidst the technological advancements, put down your gadgets from time to time, look up and see and contemplate the realities of the world. Life is a riddle, and it's there to be figured out. And you have the ability to do so. You have understanding as the image bearer of God. Use your mind to figure out the riddles of life. And one of the things that I think we see here, especially with verse 15, is one of the things, if people would actually stop to contemplate life, they would come to see that they are those with a soul, unlike dumb animals, that we are made for eternity. And if we think on those things long enough, most eventually, especially as regenerated Christians, our minds will come to Jesus Christ, the God-man who ransoms us from Sheol and takes us to God himself. All right, so that's all I have this evening. Let's go ahead and move into our time of prayer. Anything we can be in prayer for this evening?